Hello mortals, I am the goddess who created the text world of Listernia, coming to bring you another booktube video. Before you leave, please subscribe and ring that notification bell. Apparently there is an Asian readathon challenge this month created by Read with Cindy, but I was a little too late to the party to participate and it seemed a little complicated to me. However, I wanted to do something because under all this grease paint, I am a gay Asian man. Yes, my mother was Japanese and my father was Caucasian, and I've always identified as an Asian American, so I wanted to do something for Asian Awareness Month. By the way, I have experienced racism firsthand myself in the past, and I just want to say to my Asian brothers and sisters, especially millennials who think that Asian Americans don't face discrimination and there's nothing to worry about except maybe media presence. The only thing I can say is don't get too complacent, because things can change like that. It just takes the conflict with China or some other Asian country to make some people start seeing you as the other or the enemy alien. Sorry to go on that tangent, but it'll make sense why I wanted to say something. This is a perfect time to highlight an autobiography that I've had on my bookshelf for many years. It is George Takei's autobiography, To the Stars, published in 1994. I stumbled across it while browsing in a used bookstore in San Francisco, and I also discovered it was autographed. Unfortunately, it was made out to some stranger. This is not me, if you can see that. But still, it was an autographed copy, and I don't think the bookstore owners realized it was autographed because it was like $2 or something very, very cheap. George Takei is a Japanese American. I'm a Japanese American. He was a main cast member of Star Trek, and I am obsessed with Star Trek. When I got this autographed copy of George Takei's autobiography, I was expecting anecdotes and behind-the-scenes gossip about Star Trek, the show that in many ways shaped who I am. And look, it's called To the Stars. And look, he's wearing his Star Trek uniform on the cover. Have you ever started reading a book expecting one thing and then getting something completely unexpected? That's what happened to me on a very personal level. You see, I knew George Takei was a Japanese American, but it didn't really click that he was probably around the same age as my mother, who, as I said earlier, was also Japanese American. My mother passed away when I was young, but if she were alive, she'd be about the same age as George Takei. And of course, this is an autobiography, and autobiographies generally start with an overview of one's childhood. And like all Japanese Americans born before 1945, George Takei would have experienced what other Japanese Americans experienced, including my mother. That is, being imprisoned in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. And if you don't know what these camps were, and by the way, they were originally called concentration camps by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it's an important piece of American history that you should probably look up. And backing up a little, the meaning of the word concentration camp has changed after what Nazi Germany did to the Jews, which were actually death camps. But I think it was an interesting bit of history that is what the Japanese internment camps were originally called. When World War II began for the United States, FDR signed an executive order to round up anyone who had any Japanese ancestry. It didn't matter if you were an American citizen or not. If you had any Japanese ancestry, even if you were just 1/16 Japanese, you were imprisoned in these camps. George Takei was imprisoned with his family when he was around 5 or 6 in 1942. Until they were released at the end of World War II in 1946. Those are really formative years for a child, around 5 to 10. Can you imagine growing up at that age in a relocation camp? And George Takei recounts how he and his family survived the Tule Lake Relocation Center and how hard it was for his family to reintegrate back into society. imagine if you and your family lost everything and were whisked away for 4 years, then just released back onto the streets. I think it's important to listen to George Takei and those like him who are still alive and still remember. My Aunt Tosh is in her 90s and still smart as a tack, who is probably one of the older Japanese Americans still alive today who can recount stories of the camps. It happened to George Takei, it happened to my mother, and if circumstances converge, maybe it could happen again. So it's important to remember these things. It's one of those events that we should never forget, and if the only reason you decide to read this book is to get a first-hand account of that dark deed in American history, you won't be disappointed. After leaving the camps, his family settled down, and there's a really great story about George working as a strawberry picker and being mistaken as a Spanish-speaking Native American by the Japanese overseer. I won't spoil it for you, but it's a pretty good story. And I found his experience being a Japanese American actor to be really fascinating, because if you think things are hard for Asian actors now, maybe not so much now with Crazy Rich Asians, but if you were around 10 years ago, there wasn't much Asian representation in the media. Well, imagine what it was like in the 1950s and the 1960s. Then came Star Trek, and we don't get any Star Trek until halfway into the book. And even though Star Trek was really why I wanted to read the book when I got it, I didn't care that it was late in the book, because I was so interested and fascinated by the personal recollection of a Japanese American in the internment camps in World War II. And I was really drawn into the trials and tribulations of an Asian actor in a time that was extremely unfriendly to Asian actors. I think the only television show who had a regular Asian character was this funny little half-hour comedy called Eddie's Father, which I used to watch as a kid. And it had a single dad raising a son, and they had a Japanese housekeeper who acted as a surrogate nanny.
Your father telephoned. He said he will be back from San Francisco tomorrow morning. Do you understand? Wakata. Wakata. Good.
And it kind of screwed with my head, because the housekeeper and Eddie's father were about the same age, so they kind of looked like my father and my mother, but their dynamics were employee-employer.
She wants all the mothers of the students to help with the party.
Oh. That must be why Eddie said what he said last night.
What did he say?
That he needed a mother.
But also the Japanese housekeeper was kind of a surrogate mother to Eddie. So their relationship was just very weird to me, and from my perspective, because obviously I would identify with the child Eddie. Back to Star Trek. When I say that Star Trek shaped me, I'm not lying. Unless you're of my generation, you really cannot grasp the impact Star Trek had on nerdy kids like myself. When it came to science fiction or fantasy, there was really almost nothing on television. Certainly nothing of any quality, except for Star Trek. Also, keep in mind that there was no internet, there was no streaming site, there was no VCRs, there were no CDs, there was no way to record anything on television. And there were just 3 networks that produced shows. And you could only watch those shows when they aired. There was also a lot of reruns of shows. That was 80% of all of television in those days. You wonder why men and women of a certain age know so much about Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, The Flintstones, Brady Bunch, Gilligan's Island, I Love Lucy, and a handful of other shows. Because there was not anything else to watch. Even if you didn't particularly like one of those shows, you'd somehow end up watching them anyway, either at home when you're bored or at a friend's house or whatever. And one of those shows was Star Trek. It wasn't on as a rerun as often as, say, Gilligan's Island or Brady Bunch, but you could usually find it on once a week. And it was the only quality science fiction, certainly one of the only shows with the cast that included an African American, Lieutenant Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols, and a Japanese American, Sulu, played by George Takei. To say that I and many others were shaped by the original Star Trek series is no exaggeration. There is a reason why there was an unprecedented phenomenon in the 70s and 80s of conventions popping up celebrating Star Trek. By the way, if you go to any cons, Comic-Con, BookCon, whatever con, you can thank those Star Trek conventions for paving the way, because nothing like that existed before them. George Takei talks a lot about how much of a jerk William Shatner was to the second tier cast of characters on Star Trek. Rumors you hear about if you follow Star Trek, but George really gets into it, which is kind of neat.
Bill is a dynamic presence. He enjoys being the center of everything, and when he's on the set, he dominates. You may have heard about some of the difficulties that cast members had. We might be preparing a scene where it'd be a close-up on you, and then it would shift to Bill, and then you'd see Bill in a whispered conversation with the director, and the setup was changed, and it was on Bill, and you were the offstage voice. And so things like that, sometimes has a way of rubbing you in one direction.
He also talks about his interactions with Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. And George Takei talks about how much he was involved with the fandom from the early days, which I thought was really nice. By the way, even if William Shatner was a jerk, I want to say that he is the best captain of any Star Trek series. I know he was a big ham and he chewed up the scenery, but that's what made him so freaking awesome. If you saw that movie Generations, which was a crossover between the original Star Trek series and The Next Generation, Captain Kirk outshone every actor in every scene that he was in, including with Captain Picard. Sorry, not sorry, but Kirk was the best captain, and I'm sorry he was a jerk to people, but he will always be my favorite captain.
Look, history records that you died saving the Enterprise B from an energy ribbon 80 years ago.
You say this is the 24th century?
Uh-huh.
And I'm dead?
Not exactly. As I said, this is some kind of...
The temporal nexus, yes, I heard you. Something is missing.
The writing itself is solid and mostly conversational. It's not spectacular writing, but there's enough description to paint pictures in your mind and enough inner dialogue to understand George's feelings and thought. One final interesting point about this autobiography. Throughout the entire book, I noticed, when I read it at the time, that there was not one mention of any romance. He talked a lot about his family when he was younger and about his friends when he was older, but there was nothing about any relationships. At the time when I read it, I thought, this is curious. I wonder if he's gay. George Takei did come out, but it was about 10 years after this book was published, which makes this autobiography a telling example of the lengths some people went through to hide their sexuality. From what I understand, reading more about George Takei, he didn't come out publicly for the sake of his career, which was not unusual at that time. In other words, it was apparently an open secret that he was gay, but he felt, as I'm sure many LGBTQ plus felt at the time, that coming out would end his career. So reading this, you'll find, like I did, that by not mentioning any romantic relationship, it made it all that more blatantly obvious that he was hiding something. Overall, I give George Takei's autobiography 2 stars. My blessing. It is a look at the Japanese relocation camps from someone who was in prison in one. It's a tale about what it was like to be a struggling Asian actor in the 50s and 60s. And it contains personal anecdotes about the most impactful science fiction series of all time, Star Trek. Please subscribe and ring that notification bell, and may all the books you read be blessed.